All right, so you wanted to understand the history of Romania's Legionary movement?
Hmm.
Well, we're going straight to the source for this deep dive, Corneliu Codreanu's History of the Legionary Movement.
Okay.
It's his personal account, so we're going to get his perspective on how this whole thing kind of unfolded.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because you're basically getting a front row seat to history.
Yeah.
Um, Codrano takes us back to Romania after World War I,
Okay.
a time of just immense change and uncertainty. You know, the country had doubled in size,
Right.
which is a source of national pride, of course.
Sure.
But there was also this looming threat of communism spreading from the east.
Yeah, it's like this backdrop of national triumph and anxiety. It really sets the stage for the whole movement.
Absolutely.
Codreanu, as a young student in IC, was already deeply troubled by the rise of communism.
He was. And you know what really bothered him even more than the ideology itself?
Mm-hmm.
Was what he saw as the apathy of his fellow students.
Yeah.
He paints this picture of Romanian society almost sleepwalking into a potential communist takeover.
He even talks about this incident in the Dobiana forest, right?
Exactly. He and his
Uh-huh.
friends were out there.
Yeah.
And they made this pact to resist communism, even if it meant going underground.
Wow.
This event became a defining moment for Codreanu, almost foreshadowing the dedication and, you could say, the militaristic mindset
Right.
that would characterize the movement later on.
So this early experience really seems to shape his entire outlook.
He does.
And then he meets this worker, Constantine Panko, who's leading a nationalist movement among workers.
Right.
And they team up.
They do.
They start organizing these workers into national unions.
That's right. These national unions were essentially their way of countering the growing influence of communist labor organization.
Okay.
It was about creating a space for workers who embraced nationalism and rejected Marxist ideology.
So very much pushing back against that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Codreanu was very clear about his dedication to Romania.
Yeah.
You know, he had this powerful quote: "We do not recognize the right of anyone to set up on the land of Romania any flag other than that of our national history."
Wow.
For him, it was all about Romanian justice within a Romanian framework.
That quote really captures that sense of patriotism at the heart of the movement.
It does.
But it also raises some questions like, what exactly did Romanian justice look like in his vision?
Right.
And who got to decide what that meant?
Those are important questions, and they become even more significant as we see the movement gain momentum, particularly among students.
Yeah, he describes this sudden surge of national sentiment sweeping across Romanian universities. It's almost like this spontaneous wildfire erupting.
It was,
Yeah.
but we can't ignore the fuel that was feeding that fire.
Right.
Part of it was this growing wave of anti-Semitism.
Okay.
There was a significant influx of Jewish students into universities at the time, exceeding their proportion in the general population.
Right.
This led to anxieties,
Yeah.
particularly among students who felt like they were being pushed out.
So it was this combination of factors at play.
Exactly.
There was this perceived connection between Jewish communities and communism,
Uh-huh.
but there was also economic resentment,
Yeah.
with Jewish communities perceived as being more successful in certain sectors.
Exactly. It's important to remember that this was happening against the backdrop of the global economic crisis,
Of course.
which only intensified these anxieties and resentments.
And how does Codreanu address these feelings? I mean, was he feeding into the anti-Semitism, or was he trying to moderate it?
That's where things get a bit complicated. Early on, Codreanu doesn't shy away from using anti-Semitic rhetoric.
Okay.
He clearly tapped into those existing prejudices.
Right.
But later in his writings, he seems to acknowledge the limitations of placing all the blame on the so-called Jewish question.
Interesting.
He even starts pointing to the corruption within the Romanian ruling class as a major factor in the country's problems.
It's almost like he's trying to broaden the movement's focus.
Yeah.
But was this a genuine shift in his thinking, or was it more about political strategy?
That's hard to say definitively.
Yeah.
It's certainly possible that he saw the limitations of solely relying on anti-Semitism as a rallying cry as the movement grew and sought to expand its base.
Right.
But regardless of his motivations, the anti-Semitism was already deeply ingrained in the movement's DNA.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of how easily prejudice can become entwined with political movements.
Absolutely.
Even those claiming to be fighting for noble goals.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, things were about to get even more volatile
Right.
as these student protests began to escalate.
You're absolutely right. It starts with boycotts and demonstrations,
Sure.
but it quickly spirals into clashes with authorities and even targeted attacks on Jewish businesses.
Wow.
The situation on campuses was becoming increasingly chaotic and violent.
And Codreanu himself was right at the center of it. He was.
Right.
He describes blocking the entrance to the university,
Yeah.
demanding a religious ceremony be held.
He was unwavering in his convictions, even when faced with opposition.
Right. And this incident, this act of defiance, was very symbolic of his approach. It was almost theatrical. It was a clear message. He was willing to go to any length to uphold his beliefs.
And then there's the numerous clausus movement,
Right.
which aimed to limit Jewish enrollment in universities.
Yes.
It just seems like a blatant attempt to codify discrimination.
It was, and it sparked even more violent confrontations. What's particularly chilling is the account of Ion Moda's attempted assassination of a student who had betrayed the nationalist cause.
Oh, wow.
It shows just how far they were willing to go to punish anyone who they perceived as a traitor to the movement.
That's a dark turn, and it's hard not to see it as a direct result of the movement's increasingly aggressive rhetoric.
Absolutely. This incident was a turning point for Codreanu and the movement as a whole.
Okay.
He ends up in Vaccaresti prison for his role in the attempted assassination.
So we've got this young, fiery Codreanu, deeply troubled by communism, fueled by patriotism, and unfortunately some troubling prejudices.
Right. He helps ignite this student movement. Things get violent, and he ends up in prison. It's a pretty dramatic start.
It is, and his time in Vaccaresti prison is where we really see the Legionary movement begin to take shape.
Okay.
He undergoes a profound spiritual transformation, which will have a profound impact on the movement's direction and ideology.
I'm really curious to hear more about this transformation and how it influenced the movement's evolution, but I think we'll have to save that for the next part of our deep dive. So we left off with Codreanu in Vaccaresti prison, right? This is where things really start to get interesting. He describes this profound spiritual awakening that ends up shaping the entire future of the Legionary movement. What exactly happened in that prison cell?
Well, his time in Vaccaresti was definitely a turning point. You know, he went through this period of intense introspection, reflecting on his experiences, and really developing a more defined vision for the movement.
Okay.
He talks about finding solace in his faith and feeling this really deep connection to Romanian history and traditions.
You mentioned earlier that he starts to distance himself from solely blaming the Jewish question for Romania's problems. Was this part of that prison epiphany?
It's hard to say for sure, but it does seem like his time in prison gave him a new perspective. You know, he starts to criticize the corruption within the Romanian ruling class,
Okay.
arguing that their dirty politics were as detrimental to the country as any external threat.
So it's almost like he's broadening his critique of the existing power structures. He's
Right.
no longer just focused on communism or the perceived threat from Jewish communities.
Right.
He's now targeting the entire political establishment.
Exactly. And this shift in focus has a significant impact on the movement's direction.
Okay.
He emerges from prison with a more refined ideology, one that blends nationalism with a strong spiritual component and a deep distrust of traditional political parties.
So how does this new vision translate into action? What does the Legionary movement actually look like after Codreanu gets out of prison?
One of the first things he does is establish the Legion of the Archangel Michael. Remember that incident at the university where he demanded a religious ceremony?
Yeah.
It's clear that faith was becoming a more central element in his thinking, and this new organization really reflects that.
The name itself is pretty striking. It evokes this imagery of a warrior angel fighting against evil.
Right.
It's a powerful symbol, especially for a movement that saw itself as engaged in a spiritual battle for the soul of Romania.
Absolutely. The Archangel Michael becomes a central figure in the legionary mythology.
Right.
He represents their dedication to fighting for a righteous cause,
Okay.
their willingness to confront what they perceived as the forces of darkness threatening Romania.
And it wasn't just about symbolism, right? They were also putting this ideology into practice through concrete actions. I'm thinking specifically about the work camps they started organizing.
The work camps were a key part of Codreanu's vision.
Yeah.
They were designed to instill discipline, self-reliance, and a sense of shared purpose among the legionary members. Students in particular were encouraged to participate, and they would literally build things with their own hands, like meeting halls and community projects.
So it was about more than just manual labor.
It was.
It was about shaping character, fostering camaraderie, and creating a new generation of Romanians who were physically and mentally strong.
Precisely. Codreanu believed that a strong nation needed strong individuals.
Right.
And the work camps were his way of forging those individuals. He envisioned this new Romanian man, someone who was disciplined, hardworking, and deeply connected to the land and the nation.
It's an interesting idea, this concept of a new Romanian man. Was it purely about physical strength and discipline, or was there a moral dimension to it as well?
There was definitely a moral component.
Hmm.
Codreanu emphasized the importance of honesty, integrity, and self-sacrifice. He wanted to create a generation of Romanians who were not only physically strong, but also morally upright people who would put the needs of the nation above their own personal interests.
It's a pretty demanding ideal, and it makes you wonder how effective they were at actually putting it into practice. I mean, we've already seen how the movement could be prone to violence and intolerance.
That's a valid point, and it's something we need to keep in mind as we examine the movement's evolution.
Mm.
It's easy to get caught up in the rhetoric of national renewal and spiritual revival.
Right.
But we can't ignore the darker aspects of the legionary ideology and the ways in which it could be used to justify violence and exclusion.
So we've got Codreanu out of prison, spiritually transformed, founding the Legion of the Archangel Michael, and setting up these work camps to forge his new Romanian man. It feels like the movement is gaining momentum, but how were they received by the broader public? And what about the political establishment? Did they just stand by and watch this all unfold?
Well, the legionary movement wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms. Remember, Codreanu had emerged from prison with a deep distrust of traditional political parties.
Yeah.
He saw them as corrupt and self-serving, more interested in maintaining their own power than addressing the real problems facing Romania.
So he wasn't interested in playing the traditional political game. He saw the entire system as the enemy.
Exactly. And this stance put him at odds with the political establishment.
Right.
The legionary movement was viewed as a threat, a radical force
Yeah.
that could potentially disrupt the existing order.
And how did the legionaries respond to this opposition? Did they retreat, or did they double down on their confrontational approach?
They definitely didn't back down. In fact, they saw this opposition as further evidence that they were on the right track.
Okay.
They believed they were fighting against a corrupt system that was trying to silence them because they represented a genuine threat to the status quo.
It's almost like they were embracing the role of outsiders, the rebels fighting against a corrupt establishment. That kind of narrative can be very powerful, especially for a movement that's trying to mobilize young people and those who feel disenfranchised by the system.
You're absolutely right, and they were very effective at using this narrative to their advantage. They portrayed themselves as the true voice of the people,
Okay.
the only ones who could clean up the corruption and restore Romania to greatness.
So they were positioning themselves as the alternative, the solution to the problems plaguing Romania. But what did that actually look like in practice? What were their concrete goals, and how did they plan to achieve them?
Well, to understand their goals, we need to look at the broader political landscape of Romania in the 1930s.
Okay.
The country was in a state of turmoil. The Great Depression had hit Romania hard, and there was a lot of social unrest. People were looking for answers for someone to lead them out of this crisis.
So it was a perfect breeding ground for a movement that promised radical change.
Exactly, and that's where the Iron Guard comes in. Codreanu realized that if they wanted to achieve their goals, they needed to engage in the political arena. The Iron Guard was their way of doing that. It was a more explicitly political organization aimed at winning power through elections.
So it was a shift from this more cultural and spiritual focus to a more direct engagement with politics.
Precisely, and they saw some success. Codreanu describes winning seats in parliament, but it was a constant struggle against a system that was rigged against them. The authorities used every trick in the book to try to suppress the Iron Guard. Bans, arrests, police brutality.
It sounds like things were getting pretty intense. Were the Iron Guard members willing to fight back against this repression, or were they committed to nonviolence?
That's where we see this tension in Codreanu's thinking. On the one hand, he emphasizes the importance of winning hearts and minds through persuasion. He talks about the need to build a movement based on moral principles. But on the other hand, he also justifies violence as a necessary means of self-defense against a corrupt and oppressive state.
It's a dangerous line to walk, and it's a tension that we see throughout history with movements that start out with idealistic goals, but then resort to violence when they feel threatened.
You're absolutely right, and this tension comes to a head with the assassination of Prime Minister Duca in 1933.
Okay.
This event becomes a defining moment in the legionary movement's history, for better or worse.
This assassination is pretty controversial, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even Codreanu himself seems conflicted about it. He tries to distance the movement's leadership from the act, but he also presents it as a consequence of the government's repression.
It's a classic example of trying to justify the means with the ends.
Right.
And it raises some really important questions about the legitimacy of a movement that claims to be fighting for a just cause, but then resorts to political violence.
It seems like this assassination marks a turning point for the Legionary movement, both in terms of public perception and their relationship with the state. Things are clearly escalating.
You're right, the assassination of Duca throws fuel on the fire. It intensifies the government's crackdown on the Iron Guard, and it creates a climate of fear and uncertainty in Romanian society. The stakes are getting higher, and the potential for violence is growing.
This is getting really heavy. I'm kind of dreading what's coming next, but I guess we have to keep going to understand how this whole thing unfolds.
You're right, it's a complicated and often tragic story,
Mm-hmm.
but it's important to understand these events if we want to grasp the full complexity of the Legionary movement and its lasting impact on Romanian history.
Okay, so the Legionary movement is facing increasing pressure from the government. They're being banned, their members are being arrested, and there's this constant threat of violence hanging over everything. It's a pretty volatile situation.
It is.
How do they respond to this pressure? Do they go into hiding or do they become even more defiant?
Well, if there's one thing we've learned about Codreanu, it's that he doesn't back down from a challenge. In fact, he sees this repression as further validation of their cause. He reinforces their belief that they're up against a corrupt system that's desperate to silence them.
So they're doubling down on this narrative of being the righteous underdogs, the true patriots fighting against a corrupt establishment.
Exactly. And this narrative plays a key role in their propaganda. They contrast their own sincerity and dedication with the perceived emptiness and corruption of the traditional political parties.
Okay.
They promise to restore Romania to greatness, to revive its culture and traditions.
They were really good at tapping into this deep well of national pride and this longing for a better future.
And they were.
And they weren't just appealing to people's emotions, they were also offering a very specific vision of what that better future would look like.
Right.
I'm thinking about this concept of the captain that Codreanu keeps referring to. What's that all about?
Well, the captain is a recurring motif in Codreanu's writings. It's this almost mythical figure, a leader who emerges in times of crisis to embody the nation's will and lead them to salvation.
It's a powerful archetype for sure, and it's not hard to see how Codreanu saw himself fitting into that mold. He was presenting himself as the strong, charismatic leader that Romania needed to navigate these turbulent times.
He was, and he drew heavily on Romanian history to support this idea. He talked about these legendary captains from the past,
Right.
figures who had risen from the people to defend the nation against its enemies. He was trying to position himself within that lineage as the heir to this heroic tradition.
It's interesting how he's weaving together these historical narratives with his own personal vision. He's creating this whole mythology around the Legionary movement, almost like a modern-day epic.
He was a master storyteller, and he understood the power of myth and symbolism. He knew that to inspire people, to motivate them to make sacrifices,
Right.
you needed to give them something bigger than themselves to believe in.
And it wasn't just about believing in the captain, right? It was also about personal transformation.
Yeah.
He talks a lot about creating this new Romanian man. What did he mean by that?
The new Romanian man was this ideal that Codreanu envisioned, a kind of archetype of the ideal legionary member.
Oh.
It wasn't just about physical strength and discipline. It was also about moral character, spiritual purity, and a deep love for the nation.
So they were trying to cultivate a certain type of person.
Yeah.
Someone who embodied these values and was willing to fight for the legionary cause.
Exactly, and they had very specific methods for doing this.
Yeah.
They organized these incredibly rigorous training programs and rituals.
Okay.
We're talking about military drills, work camps, even death oaths.
That sounds pretty intense. It kind of reminds me of those ancient warrior societies where young men would go through these grueling initiation rites to prove their loyalty and their strength.
It was very much in that vein.
Hmm.
They were trying to forge a new elite, a brotherhood bound by shared sacrifice and unwavering loyalty to the cause.
Right.
And this emphasis on personal transformation was a key part of their appeal.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about changing the political system.
Mm-hmm.
It was about changing individuals from the inside out.
It's a powerful idea, and it makes me think about some of the other movements that we've explored that have tried to do something similar. I'm thinking about the Bolsheviks in Russia, the fascists in Italy, even the Nazis in Germany.
Sure.
They all had this element of personal transformation, this idea that they were creating a new type of human being.
It's a recurring theme in totalitarian movements throughout history. They understand that to achieve their goals,
Yeah.
they need to reshape human nature itself. They need to create individuals who are completely devoted to the cause, who are willing to sacrifice everything for the collective.
It's a chilling thought, and it makes you wonder how Codreanu reconciled this vision of a new Romanian man with his earlier anti-Semitism. I mean, were Jewish people included in this vision of national renewal?
That's a good question, and it points to one of the fundamental contradictions at the heart of the Legionary movement.
Okay.
On the one hand, they talk about this spiritual revival, this return to Romanian traditions and values.
Right.
But on the other hand, they define those traditions and values in a very narrow and exclusionary way.
So they're basically saying that to be a true Romanian, you have to conform to their very specific definition of what that means. And anyone who doesn't fit that definition is automatically excluded.
That's the danger of this kind of thinking.
Yeah.
It creates a very clear division between us and them.
Right.
And it can easily be used to justify violence and discrimination against those who are perceived as different or threatening.
And even though Codreanu tries to soften his stance on the Jewish question later on, it seems like that prejudice was already deeply embedded in the movement's DNA. It's like a virus that infected the entire ideology.
That's a good analogy, and it highlights the insidious nature of prejudice. It can seep into even the most well-intentioned movements, distorting their goals and leading them down a dangerous path.
So where does this all leave us? We've got this charismatic leader, this vision of a new Romanian man, this intense focus on culture and spirituality, and this underlying current of intolerance and violence. It's a pretty potent mix.
It is, and it helps explain how the Legionary movement was able to attract such a devoted following.
Right.
They were offering people a sense of belonging, a purpose, or a chance to be part of something bigger than themselves.
Yeah.
But they were also offering a very dangerous and ultimately destructive ideology.
And that's the tragedy of the Legionary movement, isn't it? It started with these idealistic goals of national revival and social justice, but it ended up embracing the very things it claimed to be fighting against. Violence, intolerance, and authoritarianism.
Exactly, and it's a cautionary tale for us today. It reminds us of the dangers of unchecked nationalism, the seductive power of charismatic leadership, and the importance of critical thinking and tolerance in the face of extremist ideologies.
So there you have it. We dove deep into the history of the Legionary movement, exploring its origins, its ideology, and its ultimately tragic trajectory. It's a complex and challenging story.
It is.
But it's one that I think we can all learn from.
I agree. It's a story that forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about human nature and the ways in which idealism can be twisted into something dangerous and destructive. But it's also a story that reminds us of the importance of vigilance, of resisting the allure of simplistic solutions and easy answers, and of always striving to build a more just and inclusive world.